Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. My name is Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me JL Hancock. JL is the former lead innovator for the U.S. Special Operations Community, now turned thrilling fiction author of the book, The Hawk Enigma. It was in 2002 that JL enlisted in the Navy and spent 22 years as a cryptologist. During his time in the military, Jim toiled away in the dark corners of the government intelligence communities, learned 2 Asian languages, and eventually conducted over 100 combat operations with special forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Philippines. During the last 6 years of his career, he worked as a senior enlisted advisor over future concepts and innovation for the military special operations community, where he became a well-known subject matter expert in unmanned systems, 5G, and artificial intelligence. Today, we're going to dive into all things military intelligence, maybe how robotics might end us all, and how JL came up with the plot for his book. JL, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
I think when I speak to a lot of people that have been in the military, it seems everyone has a different route for where they enter and why. And so I wonder where your catalyst was to decide to enlist.
Mine was actually pretty straightforward in the sense that it was literally because of 9/11 that I joined the military. I had been living in Japan for a couple of years, and I had returned, and it was no less than a month and a half later that 9/11 took place. And it was just coincidentally, I happened to have been with my best friend, and he wanted to go talk to the Navy recruiters. He has a long history with the Navy, and his story is a long one as to why he wanted to be there. But I had zero interest in actually joining the military until I went down, talked to the recruiters, and I found out about a place called the Defense Language Institute. And since I already spoke Japanese, that I learned that they could take if you get into this program, you go to this language school where they'll teach you another foreign language, and then you get to basically be a linguist for the military. And so that was exciting, but I just put it in my back pocket and was like, I'll think about it. I'd already tested and scored well, and I'd already qualified for the schools. I just didn't know if that was the direction I wanted to go. And then literally it was probably not even 2 weeks later was 9/11. And so I did something called delay enlistment, where I joined, but I didn't have to go to boot camp for a while. There was some other schooling I wanted to finish first. And then there was I went off to work as a river guide on the Colorado River in southern Utah for the summer, and I'd been planning to do that, and it was kind of a rite of passage in my family that you have to go off and be a river guide. And so I went and did that, and then I joined the Navy immediately after that. So I went from living effectively homeless in a tent to going into the military after, because as a river guide, I had no responsibilities. I literally just got up in the morning, checked to see if I was on the schedule for whatever trip was going on that day, and if I wasn't, then I just grabbed my kayak and jumped in the river, and then kayaked all day long until my friends got back from work, and then we'd go rock climbing. And that was my life for like 4 or 5 months. And then I went from that absolute freedom to boot camp, which was pretty rough. I thought I was taking a better step in my life, and then I was in a room learning how to brush my teeth. So there you go. But it was a big shift, so it was, but in the end, it was probably one of the best decisions I made in my life. So.
Yeah. Right. It talked about shell shock, like from river guide to that environment. It was super structured, I imagine. But then from there to training for combat missions and what that must look like. Now, what was the difference between phase 2 and phase 3? Because it said you did several combat operations. Now, is combat operations the same as doing a tour, or is it something specifically different that you'll go in with a targeted purpose to do something and come out?
So a combat operation is literally think of when somebody goes on a mission to go fly in and eliminate a target or capture somebody, that's a combat operation. And then deployments are that period of time in which you are forward deployed and placed in a strategic location. So I was in Iraq for 6 months, in the Philippines for 8 months, and Afghanistan for 5 months. And during those periods of time, accumulatively, I did about 100 combat operations. But that was when I first got in as a linguist. So just so people have context, there's different types of linguists in the military. Some linguists only learn to just translate foreign languages, but they have a primary job in addition to that. So, like, for example, if they work on a ship, they may be a quartermaster or a bosun's mate or something that actually works on the ship, but they have a secondary skill because they speak a foreign language, and they are used as like a translator on the ship. But that is not their primary job. The linguist title, as most people may understand it, is also what's called a cryptologist. So cryptologic technicians come in different flavors. And we say that because they all say CT, and then there's another letter that comes after it. In my case, it was I, which stands for interpretive. But all cryptologists, even if they learn a foreign language or they learn signals, they all have to understand the basics of radio propagation theory. And because you have to understand radio propagation theory and understand radio frequency transmission and the electromagnetic spectrum, you're now dual-hatted. It's just you happen to lean more on your ability to use foreign languages. And so in the beginning, when I first got in the Navy and after I graduated my school and I went to my first duty station, I primarily leaned on, that was the language skills that I had, and that was my main job. However, I found out about this program where you could be embedded with different special operations units to help them conduct certain operations. And that was extremely exciting to me. And so I screened for that program and screened positively and was accepted in. And so started that in January of 2008. And that was basically until the end. I retired. I stayed almost the entire time in that community. I went back to certain parts of the intelligence community for a short period, but in general, I stayed in that community for the rest of the time I was in the Navy.
Wow. Yeah, it must be nice to have found a place after jumping around, like I said, from river guide to all these things, to a place that you really wanted to stay. Was it more like the job itself, the operations, what you were doing? Was there the purpose that involved wanting you to stay, or was it like the camaraderie or everything together?
You can always say it's a mixture of all of it. The mission was always the biggest part because you were excited about the job. You knew the importance of the job.
Right.
But it was also extremely complex. The thing that I kind of prided myself on within that particular job community, especially when it came to combat operations, is it was less about how well you knew how to do the job and more about your ability to adapt to difficult situations. And it was not a single moment went by where my equipment worked perfectly or I wasn't having to manage personalities. And believe it or not, I did spend a lot of my time with the special operations community. And when people ask me what my favorite part was about it, I would say, well, I had the honor and privilege of being embedded and working with the SEAL teams. And then when they ask what was the worst part about it, it's like, well, in one hand, I had the opportunity to work with SEALs, and on the other hand, I had to work with SEALs. And so you can say, well, okay, how different is that? It's like it's night and day. You're dealing with a community of people that are screened for being mentally tough, but being mentally tough is also synonymous with being stubborn and hard-headed. And so you have all these people that are some of the most stubborn and hard-headed people on the planet, and they all think they're right. And some of them are, and some of them are absolutely incredible individuals. It's this interesting gamut where you have on one side, there are people that literally live up to every stereotype I ever thought of that community. They're some of the most incredible human beings I've ever met. And on the other hand, there are individuals that were not that. Let me just put it that way. Okay. And but they were still very, very strong willed. And so you're having to manage that. And then as an outsider, you're having to deal with all of their, the cultural intricacies associated with being an outsider. But nonetheless, at the time, they had no job if I wasn't there. They didn't know where to go. My job was literally to tell them where to go because of the way that the equipment that I used and how the job I did. And so I think the easiest way to describe my role inside of one of those operations is if you watch a movie and for some reason there's a guy with a computer in front of everybody telling him where to go. That was kind of like me. I didn't have a computer. I had some other things, and it was a lot more subtle than that. And I built it into my kits on my body armor so you couldn't see what I was actually doing. However,
Right.
if I didn't do my job, they didn't know where to go. And so it was very critical. And there were very few of us that actually could do that job. Like, so there were less than 100 of us total in the entire Navy. And
Wow.
when I was in Iraq, I was the only person in the entire southern part of the country that had that skill set. So I had to jump between different units almost every night because they needed to go on a mission and they needed our skill set. And so it was an interesting spot to be in a position where you are critical to the mission, but some people literally don't want you there because very virtue of the fact that you aren't one of them and you're not wearing a
Wow.
certain insignia on your chest. Now, and I understand certain aspects of training and I understand the cultural background behind it and also a level of trust. I totally understood that and I appreciated it. At the same time, the job still needs to be done. And those of us are doing everything we can to make sure that we are a force multiplier in the equation rather than a detraction.
Right. Because I imagine are you going with them on a lot of these missions? Or are you like in a superhero parlance would be you're like the guy in the chair where we're telling
Yeah.
people with the laptop, go here, opening doors, like
No, I was
Mission Impossible trope, if you will.
if there was a stack of people running up to where they needed to go, I was the second or third guy in the line.
Okay.
Because literally they don't know where to go unless I tell them where to go. I'm not saying like that from the rear. I'm saying literally on the ground, I have to tell them where to go.
Right.
Oh, so it's a
So
very, and I can't say specifically why that's the case, unfortunately, because of what we were doing.
right.
And, but it was critical and it was a dangerous position, because of the fact of like, literally you're out in front of everybody and so you're exposed and you're focusing on some equipment. So you don't maintain the same situational awareness. So you really have to trust the person next to you to be able to handle you. You have a handler. You have somebody beside you that effectively their job is to keep you alive.
Hmm.
Granted, at the same time, it's not like I was always of the mindset of, I'm not completely incompetent, so I'm going to be able to handle myself. And in certain units, they didn't even give me a handler. They just set me off by myself in front of everybody. Like, I was like just basically waiting to get shot. So,
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
but it was, and I laugh about it now, but it was just depending upon the unit and the way that it worked. Sometimes it made more sense to just do that. But they trusted me enough to do it. So it worked. I wouldn't say that was the norm. Uh, it's
Right.
all personality driven. And that was the hardest part about that particular community was finding an individual that we looked for 3 traits when we pulled people into that program. We looked for individuals that had the technical acumen, that they had the physical fitness to be able to keep up with these individuals, because they under no circumstances could you ever slow anybody down. You had to be just as fast as everything else was going on as them. You didn't
Yep.
have to be everything the same as them, because that was a completely different skill set. Because if you could do that, then you would become one of them, and then there's nobody doing our job, right? And then the last one
Sure.
is your personality. Did you have the personality to fit in with that group of individuals in a way to where they could gain your trust and they could understand your value? And that was a unique trait that was very difficult to find. And so that was why it was hard for us when we screen people for the program. We were searching for all of those things, and it was hard to find them all the time. And and even with the people that we brought in, some didn't make it. Not in a really bad way, like in a way that they just weren't good for the program. Not in the sense that we lost them. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
Yeah. That's an
yeah,
important distinction. I guess
yeah.
you having to jump into different roles and different combat missions and probably on every one had to reestablish why you were important and why they could trust you, etc. What do you think was the most helpful? I'm sure you learned this after so many missions, or maybe came naturally to you, but what do you think was the most helpful, I guess, character trait or psychological idea that you would deploy to help you manage a whole bunch of different diverse personalities on those sorts of missions?
It depended upon the platoon. So the fortunate thing is, leading up to the actual deployment, sometimes we were able to do a workup with that platoon and establish trust early on. I was always of the mindset that you always put in more work than is expected of you at a level that is both above you and below you. And what I mean by that is this: every platoon that you work with, they have a group of people that are new, and the new guy, or they just refer to them as the new guys. And the new guys have to do all the grunt work. They're the ones moving all the gear, picking up the brass, cleaning things up. Everyone has to do their part all the time, but the new guys have to do extra work. And even though I wasn't a new guy and I didn't have to, I would always go help the new guys. And then on the other end, I was always interacting with the leadership to show my strategic value and so that they could trust me. So I made sure that at every level within the platoon, they recognized my value. They knew that I was going to put out, I was going to work hard, but also I was critical and I brought value to what they were doing. And that was the thing that I had to keep in mind. And there was a lot of stress because there's so few of us. And because of the training cycles, we couldn't slip in perfectly into the way that some other embedded technicians were integrated to the platoon, because we were getting pulled back and forth between different missions all the time. So few of us, and we were in high demand, which was nice, but it also meant we weren't able to build the rapport with certain groups as quickly as we would like before we actually went downrange. And because of that, there was a lot of catching up that had to take place whenever we were interacting with these groups. And there was an education campaign constantly going on, and there was animosity, and there are antibodies that you were having to deal with, because the question was always, why are you here? Why do I need you? Why can't I train one of my people to do the same thing you're doing? We've made it through this most difficult training in the world. There's absolutely no reason why we can't just have somebody learn your skill in a week. And there was, and that the funny thing is, you say that, and I'm not joking. That is literally the mentality of certain individuals. They're like, oh, we've made it through the most difficult training block on the planet. I can do your job. And my friend here's another funny example of that. I was at a course. It was more of a cyber related course, and there was a SEAL in the room, and it was more of a familiarization type of course rather than it was something that was in depth. And my friend asked the instructor, he said, hey, is there like a 2-week course I could take to learn how to be a hacker? And the instructor said, is there like a 2-week course I can take to learn how to be a Navy SEAL? And then he laughed at him, and then he goes, but it's not the same. And he's like, but it is. Like, you don't get good at your job by doing a 2-week course. That's just not a thing. Like you don't.
You
and
don't
so
get any job.
No. And just because you've made it through one block of training that's incredibly complicated and difficult doesn't mean it's analogous to every other course that's out there or any other skill set.
Right.
And it can be simplified down to pressing a button. That was one of the other mentalities I ran into a lot, where it's just like, I can do that one thing. And it's like, you can do this one thing, but guess what? If these parameters aren't met, this whole thing collapses, and you've got to understand from start to finish how to make that all work again. And if you don't know all those other back end parts, guess what? The mission's going to fail. And if it's all on your shoulders to make sure there's mission success or failure, because this one thing has to take place, do you want to come back and say, I failed the mission because of the fact that I took a 2-week course and thought I was good? And that was always the battle, and justifying your existence. And so, but the thing is once we did one good op downrange, it was over. It was fine. I had freedom of movement that I absolutely needed. Some platoons were much harder than others. Some platoons, it was a fight every single step of the way. And then only to go down range and get attached to a different group that I didn't know at all and start all over again. And you start all over every single time you meet a new group of people, because of the nature of the job. If I had the same background that they did, they wouldn't worry about that. They'd be like, cool, got another dude, he's good. Sometimes, most of the time that's the case. You still have to kind of prove yourself. You can't just show up and just be ineffective and expect everybody to respect you. That's not a thing. So you still, yeah.
I was going to say, I probably don't know the answer to this, but are there any of the combat missions that you're able to talk about, or all of them are still classified?
I'm trying to think of one that was. The hard part is I can tell you about certain missions, but the difficult thing is explaining what I was doing, and I can't tell you what I was doing. And so, right. So it's not to say that.
I guess maybe we could wade in and try one and see how vague this gets. But I'd love the idea of knowing like a vague objective, and then how would you go about it, and what part would be most precarious? Because I can imagine if you're on the front line of anything classified as a war, that's the most vulnerable position. So like you said, you're in the top 3 people trying to show people where to go. If you turn left instead of right by accident, or if you turn right when you're supposed to go right, but there's someone waiting for you. Like that's, I'm sure I can't even fathom the amount of intensity in those sorts of situations. So I'd be curious to hear what one of these missions looked like, as much as you're able
I
to
think,
tell.
okay, so here's an example. This may not be the most sexiest of examples, but this kind of summarizes the stress of what happens. Okay, so when I was in Basra, Iraq, and Basra has as a lot of Iraqi cities do, they have a lot of low hanging power lines. And so, depending upon where we wanted to go in the city, we had to take a certain type of vehicle. We preferred to take what were called the RG-33s, which were the MRAPs, which had the V-shaped hull on the bottom in case you hit an IED. It was designed to take the hit, right? So you're much safer in an RG-33. The problem is RG-33s are huge, and they have this thing on the top called the Crows, which is a remote operated weapon system that allows you to control the gun from inside with a joystick. And then they have these antennas sticking off the back. So your vehicle, instead of being like 8 or 9 feet off the ground, your vehicle is now like 15 feet because of the antennas and things like that, right? It's just way up there.
Okay.
And so certain parts of the city you couldn't go to. And I had this equipment that had to run off of a power source internal to the vehicle. And so they would be like, hey, we're going to be heading out to this area of the city tonight. I need you to go install in the RG. And so I'd be okay. So I'd run my gear out. I'd prep it. I'd get it all locked in. I'd get it set up. I'd have my laptop set up in a spot so I could get access to it. And everything was hooked up inside the vehicle and ready to go. I'd turn around, come back in the building. And at this time, we were actually based out of what we called the Basra Palace complex, which was the former palace of, I think it was Uday Hussein's wife. And it's right on the Euphrates. And so we lived in this huge palace. It was crazy because you walk in, there's a gargantuan American flag hanging from the ceiling, and then it's empty. The whole building's like gutted except for all these American personnel living throughout. There's a big gym and there's one other back room. There's a tactical operations center. And so the Basra Palace itself was amazing. And then right next to it is a waterway that gave us access to the Euphrates. So we would jump into our boats and we would actually go through the Euphrates and do our infiltration for our missions from the river and in the middle of the night, which was amazing. It's a great feeling to be just cruising around on the river at night like that in what are called SOCR, Special Operation Craft Riverines, which are these fast attack boats for the river. And so that was right across the street from us. So we literally walk out of the palace and could jump in our boats and then go straight on the mission if we didn't want to use the vehicles. But this particular night, I had to use. I prepped the Humvee and the RG, and then we walked back in and they said, "Sorry, man, we realized we're going to take the Humvees instead. So I need you to take all your." So that once they told me that, I was like, okay, now I got to rip all my gear out of the RG and put it in the Humvees. But the Humvees, the batteries are underneath the front seat, and you open it up and the batteries are in series. So now you've got a problem. Make sure that you're not overloading your system by putting too many hooking it up to too high a voltage because you're running, it's a 24 volt system or whatever it is, right? And so you're like, all right, so now I'm playing electrician trying to hook these things up, and all I have are these alligator clips, but I've got to put the seat back down so the guy that gets the vehicle can sit down on it, but I don't want him to sit down on it so that it knocks off my cables. At the same time, I don't want him to get electrocuted. I also don't want to start a fire. And so I'm trying to settle these things up at the last minute, and they're not designed for this installation because this equipment has to come separate. And so I set it up, and I finally get it in place, and I run back in, and they're like, okay, Jim, we're going to the RG-33 again. And so now I've got to rip it back out of the Humvee, back into the RG, and I get into the RG, and I get it all prepped, and we're 5 minutes away, and I'm trying to do an op test of the equipment, and none of it's working. We're 5 minutes from go, and the gear that is the linchpin to the entire mission isn't working. It's off. Like I'm trying to run a test on it, and it's not doing its job. And so the question I have then is, do I tell everybody that we're dead in the water and make them all wait? Or do I just keep plugging away for a little bit longer and see if it'll go? And this was always the debate. Do I hold things up, making it, because there's the problem. You might be able to get it to work, but so it's just the dilemma. Like, the default state would be like, hey, tell everybody to hold up. We're not going to do anything until this is working. But sometimes you're like, this is time sensitive. Like, you better just figure it out on the fly. What are you going to do that's different while we sit here than what you're going to do while you're driving down the road? And the answer is, I don't know.
Right.
Right. But the whole thing relied on.
If you're in an environment where if you're in an environment where people are already want you to prove your worth every single second and you have to delay them, there's like a social disincentive for you to be honest, to be like, hey guys, can you hold this thing's off?
That's a really good way of putting it. There was definitely a social disincentive for being completely honest all the time, because there were certain things you're like, this is something I don't tell anybody because it will completely destroy my credibility. And so
Right.
I didn't say anything. I just kept plugging away. And then they were like, okay, everybody wheels up. And they're like, you good? And right then my stuff started working. And so I was like, yeah, good to go. So all they heard from me was that I was good to go. They didn't know that I was, but it was also self-inflicted. I would have been fine if I'd have done the initial install and I had like 30, 40 minutes to gear prep like I normally did. Instead, I had 5 minutes because they couldn't figure out which vehicle we wanted to be in. And then, so then we drive and we finally get to the destination. And I had thought that I had charged all of my gear and it was at 100%. Turns out it was at 10%. I dismount from the vehicle and all my gear dies on my body armor that's built into my kit. But I always carried a backup. And so I get out of the vehicle, it dies. I pull out the backup and I'm start running that thing by hand. And this is literally my first mission. And so then I'm crawling over all these rocks and rubble, and my job is to find this house. And I figure out which house it is. I tell them, and then all I can do is take a knee and wait to make sure and find out whether or not that was the correct house. And so all of that was gear related, had nothing to do with the actual mission. Like the sexy, exciting part of the door kicking and the swinging the guns around, that was not the stress for me. Getting to that point, once we get there, I was like, cool, this is easy. So all I got to do is get in this stack and hold the gun in this position. That's easy. It's the nebulous element of relying on technology when you can't sit there and control the Trons as they're jumping around. You know, you're basically, it's like preying on this magical device is going to work. So that's why sometimes we refer to them as PFM boxes, because they were pure freaking magic, right? A lot of people, when I explained to them how they work, they didn't understand it, and so I just was like, just call it a PFM box. And so PFM box it's a pretty common term in the military. People will use that, but it just made me laugh because people legitimately thought that's what it was the PFM box. And I was like, no, it's not the PFM box. There's no pure freaking magic box.
Well, because I wonder if those sort of communicative dynamics just makes a military or any army so much worse if no one can ever say like, we shouldn't go there, or I need 5 minutes for this thing to charge, instead of everyone trying to kind of perform this idea of bravado that everyone knows what they're doing. Like you have all these stories about, especially now over in Ukraine, about the Russian military that is just making mistake over mistake for how their situation is going. It seems like there's no communication whatsoever. And it seems like there's more adaptability for where you guys were going, but there was still that element of like, we might be walking into a bad situation, but I can't say anything because I will go crushed if I tell them that I need 5 minutes to charge.
There's a truth to that. And then there's an aspect of it that is not true. So I would say that. So the reason why I'd say that is this: if you're dealing with conventional forces, the example you just gave makes perfect sense. Special operations community, the mission is going to get done and you're going to succeed no matter what. So you don't have a choice. You will succeed or you will leave. Right. So that's not the option. So the option is that there are moments when you can say, hey, let's take a knee. Let's just wait a beat. We'll have a little bit of tactical patience and we'll make this happen. That absolutely is a place for that. And then there are other moments where you've got to just put on your big boy pants and just make it happen. Right. And so that the thing though, that was the biggest thing that I gained from that community is that you can you surprise yourself when you don't give yourself a choice. When you're like, this is hopeless, I can't do it. That's not a mentality you can have. It's like, all right, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to do this? Right. I've got a bunch of tools. I was just the person that had a lot of different tools in the toolbox. The other guys had a hammer. And most of the time their solution was to get the hammer. And I was like, we don't need a hammer all the time. And so it was a matter of convincing them to not use the hammer and to use something else. But there also is something to be said about being willing to tell someone they have an ugly baby. And that is a term that is used a lot in that community. Is a lot of senior leaders will have an ugly baby and they'll be emotionally attached to something that they either created or a mission that they want to do or something they want to get done. And someone has to be willing to come in and say, this is a terrible idea. This isn't going to work.
Wow. And is that encouraged?
Depends on the unit. It also,
Okay.
I'm going to say that is kind of usually the job of the senior enlisted person, not the senior officer. The senior enlisted person's job is to walk in and say, that's a bad idea, because they're kind of immune to having their career crushed. A junior officer, it'll crush their career. A senior officer, they have to show that they are making the right decision all the time. But a senior enlisted person, it doesn't matter. You can't hurt their career anymore. It's a completely different pipeline. They're there to be the voice of reason. And that was really how you people, when they look at the military, like, what is the, why have somebody that you have this like an 06, which is a very senior officer, and then you'll have like this E9 or E8 always by their side. That person is supposed to be there to be the voice of reason, on top of just to basically say, hey, this is something else you need to take in mind. Their job is to look after the people. And that was it's an interesting element of that community. But the operational part was really interesting, but it wasn't until the last 6 years I was in the Navy that I actually had probably the most fun. And that was when I was in charge of the innovation directorate and chasing down emerging technology. That was probably the most fun I had.
Wow. Yeah, I was about to pivot into that. Tell me a little bit more about how you got into that, and like what your day to day looked like. Was it seeking out new technologies? Was it developing your own? And were they, I guess, were they mission specific? I go in whichever way you find more relevant.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't understand that the acquisitions program for the military is an extremely robust and complicated process. And a lot of time it's based off something called JCIDS, the Joint Capabilities Integration Development System, which was originally established by the Secretary of Defense. It was McNamara back in the 1960s. And the JCIDS process mirrored the Soviet acquisition and development pipeline, because we wanted to be able to outpace the Soviets, but we didn't want to escalate the Cold War. So that the system was literally designed to not move too fast. And that worked okay until about 2000. In 2000, the ability for the manufacturing of chips for the private companies, expansion of computers, suddenly the private sector, not the national security sector, like the national laboratories, the Department of Energy laboratories, Department of Defense laboratories, private sector was now in the lead when it came to technological development. And they could use venture capital funding to move much faster than the government could. And so now the JCIDS process, which relied on these limited timelines and milestones and fiscal year defense plans and POMs, which go into like 5-year periods of time, was not going to cut what needed to happen with the speed of technology. And so these reactive processes within JCIDS that said, hey, we've recognized there's a delta and this is the thing that we're trying to solve for. Let me put some money behind it. We have funding in 2 years to pay for this thing that you've identified now. And so we would jokingly say, that's how you get 2016 technology just in time in 2024. And so my job then was to say, okay, well, look, you guys have already recognized through the requirements process that you need this technology. However, that's because you have recognized a capability gap, not because you've recognized the value of technology. Whether it be an event or a requirement, they're both reactive in nature. How do we regain the proactive aspect of chasing down research and development, science and technology solutions? And so what I did in my job is I said, okay, I'm going to watch. My job is to watch everyone's technological blind side. I'm going to watch their flank by looking for emerging technology, but because of my operational experience and my background, I could see it from a different lens. And so when I first got into the job, I was handpicked by my predecessor. He's like, I really want you to come in and take this position after I'm done. So I stepped in 2016, and I was very intimidated because they were doing a lot of projects building these different types of aircraft payloads on small. When I say aircraft, they're small aircraft. They're what are called a Group 2 UAS, which means they're about under 50 pounds. But we were putting these 5-pound sensor payloads on the back of it so that you could do different types of missions in addition to the camera. So the bird could be flying up and doing a whole bunch of different missions at the same time. But it was a small bird, so you could do it organically. Well, those payloads were having all kinds of impact and doing a lot of great stuff. However, there was a lot more we could be chasing, and we specifically wanted to start playing with quadcopters. Remind you, this is 2016. So they were on the market, but they hadn't proliferated as much. And the only thing we kept thinking about was, this is going to be the future of warfare, and we need to be ready for it. How do we get there? And so the first thing I did is I started I basically did an education campaign or a campaign of learning for myself. They gave me a travel budget and said I could go wherever I wanted, except for they weren't going to give me a budget to actually fund any projects or do any work. And I was like, well, that sounds great. So I could go places and learn things, but I can't do anything according to what you just said. However, there was no limitation for me using other people's money. If I could get somebody else to pay for things, I could literally do whatever I want. So my claim to fame was by the time I left in 2022, I had put the first artificially intelligent drone in combat. I had built a portfolio of more than 40 different projects, and I had built up more than $400 million of other people's money. And on top of that, I'd created some programs that were close to nearly $1 billion in their evaluation estimate of what they total were.
Well, and what does it mean to create $1 billion program? Does that mean you're getting funding to create that program, or the program you create somehow generates those funds?
It was a program that was allocated that much money from Congress.
Okay. So you would create a program that you think is necessary for X mission or X objective, and then you would get a congressman on your side to go and and they decide how
not
important
a congressman,
this is, how much funding, or
so
someone.
You get, usually it's done the way that's done through the military is combatant commands like SOCOM or INDOPACOM, which is in charge of the Pacific. Those kind of commands have the authority to request larger amounts of money from the government. All money that goes to the Department of Defense has to be appropriated through Congress.
Right.
All of it, right? But not a congressman, not an individual. It's the committees have to allow for the budget, and it gets
I thought you would
budget.
need like a sponsor to bring something to the, I don't know.
The sponsor is that combatant command leadership, and then them
Okay.
asking Congress, and then the Office of Secretary of Defense, and the Office of Secretary of Defense then presents it to Congress eventually. But if they've already appropriated a certain amount of money for their discretionary use, it also could be divvied out that way. Is another way the money could be put out. But then there's also what they refer to as colors of money. So money can only be used for certain use cases. So a color of money would be like research and development, procurement, operations and maintenance, or what's called DERMO, which is Defense Reutilization Management Order, which is it's a fancy way of saying throwing things away. So the process of creating new stuff, buying new things, fixing things, or throwing things away, each is a color of money. So if I have maintenance money, I can't use it to do research and development. It's against the law. If I have procurement money, I can't use it to throw things away. Okay. So the money has to be specifically used because Congress has only allowed it to be used a certain way. And that avoids, it's an ethical thing. And so R&D is like the golden goose money. You can literally use it to do whatever you want, because you could buy things, you can pay for labor, you can create new things, you can prototype it. What you can't do is sustain it. So if I build a prototype and the prototype works with R&D, I can't use R&D to continue building prototypes, that exact same prototype, because it's done. If I'm adding new capability to it, then maybe, but if I'm just creating more of them, I have to use procurement money or operations and maintenance money. Does that make sense? And so,
as much as I can get it, I guess from creating all those things, what was the most impressive innovation that you saw during your time there? And I guess after that, what's the most impressive thing you see coming to market soon?
So there were a number of things that came out of the effort that we did. A couple of the companies that we worked with ended up becoming unicorns. One of which started when I first met them. They only had 6 people. Now they're worth $3 billion.
Wow.
They're the ones that we helped put the company called Shield AI. They put the first AI drone in combat. And they, and by that, I mean, it was a quadcopter, but unlike drones that you see on television, like the MQ-9 or whatever, those are all teleoperated, meaning there's still a pilot, they're just not in the cockpit.
Right.
Or they're giving it waypoints, meaning I need you to fly from point A to point B using GPS to determine your position. What this other system did is you literally turned it on and you put it into a search mode, and then you just let go. And it flew up to a door, saw that the door was open, went into the building, and then searched the building by itself. And it chose which room to go in for what reason. And then, this was in 2018. So the more advanced variants of that could fly multi-story buildings. It could tell you which room people were in. It could map out every single floor of the building. And then you on your phone could literally be watching the map being created in real time. I had another program I was running where I had that bird with another company system where you literally could control from one controller, launch multiple systems, one to clear the building and the others to fly around and search and hold perimeter. And then if somebody jumps out, it would lock onto them and then chase them. And by chase them, it actually was, it was the cool thing about it. Now, it sounds scary, but here's what's not cool about it. These drones are harmless. They can't do anything. They don't have weapons on them. They're just cameras, right? But one of the drones, it was designed as like a really advanced selfie stick. So it would stay in front of you no matter what position you're in. Well, that's great if you know that that's what it's doing. But if you're trying to run away from a drone and it keeps getting in front of you, and then you turn around to run the other way, and then it flies and gets in front of you again, it has this corralling effect that scares the living heck out of you. But what the great part is
probably think it's armed.
You think it's armed, and it's not. That's what the best part about it is. It's all psychological, and it's completely harmless. And so that's why
how long until those get armed? Because I'm sure we're
they will go that direction because that's the direction they want to go. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about everything will eventually can be turned into a weapon. I mean, a kid in my high school lost his eye because someone stabbed him with a pencil. So like these are everything can be weaponized, right? There's my upbringing. There's a crazy school I went to. So there's everything can be weaponized, and you are correct. However, and that's happening right now in Ukraine, everywhere. All of them are being weaponized, right? We all know this. But we were playing around with how to not only weaponize, but to defeat the weaponization of those back in 2016. We were solving those problems back then at the low level, doing these experimentation events where every 3 months we'd go out to the field for like 2 weeks and we would just experiment. And I didn't allow anyone in my office that wasn't what we like to refer to as a wrench turner, somebody who actually would build stuff on their own. If you didn't come in with your own projects, I would kick you out. I'm like, you have to be working. And so you're right alongside all these engineers doing milestones for their projects, integrating a bunch of technology, but you yourself had to be hungry at all times. And the in test that I had for people is when they showed up is I gave them a box of broken drone parts and access to YouTube. And I said, you have 4 days to make me a drone. Go. And it has to work. And they would be like, I don't know how to do this. And I'm like, that is literally the point. I know you can't do this. And so the job this is the job. We get asked to figure out and learn things that no one knows. And and there's not like a course you can take to learn it. You just have to figure it out, because guess what? All of a sudden I walked into work one day and they said, hey, Jim, what do you know about quantum? Like, nothing. Looks like I got to take a trip. So next thing I know, I was becoming the quantum specialist, now I'm having to explain the difference between quantum sensors and qubits and all these different things to my leadership. But it only because if I didn't chase it down, no one was. And then all of a sudden we've lost leverage and we've lost the edge. And so it's about maintaining that edge is what the job was all about. And that was what was exciting about it, is we were perpetually just looking for these new technologies and ways to employ them in a way that would impact and mitigate risk. And this was the big point that I if I could reiterate anything about the drones that we mentioned before, people get scared about weaponization, but I'm a big believer of drones mitigating risk to civilians and everyone else, law enforcement, everyone. And here's a scenario I can give you. And I thought about this a lot especially during 2020, because we were all at home and had lots of times to think about these things. So in America, we're having all of a sudden these incidences of police and race and all these different things going on. And there was one particular instance in which a woman by the name of Breonna Taylor was tragically killed in her home when police went in. And I watched the footage of how they entered the house and why they did this. And there was a really stupid policy conflict in that state where you had both a no-knock warrant authorization and then the ability to stand your ground with a gun. So that meant that you could be in your house and defend yourself if somebody kicks your door down and doesn't say who they are, but the police also had the authority to kick down your door and not say who they are. So you're just waiting for everybody to get shot. It was just the leadership in that state it was a horrible thing. It was just stupid. I can understand the defend yourself, but the no-knock warrant. But there was no reason for the police to go in that way. But the whole time I was thinking, if they had one of these drones, all they had to do is this. You knock on the door. They don't open it. You can even kick down the door. But you don't kick down the door and send a person running through.
With a gun.
You knock the door down, get out of the way, and you send in the drone. Now, here's why the drone is better. People are like, I don't want a drone flying through my house. Well, do you want a dude with a gun in your house? I would take the drone in my house over a person with a gun in my house every day of the week because the drone is going to be loud. I know what's going on. It might be a little frightening, but it's just a drone. All it is a flying camera. It's giving situational awareness, and people can be scared. But here's the thing is it's mitigating risk by putting separation between the individuals that are emotionally in the situation, and they both feel that they're at risk. Now, neither one of them needs to be afraid because you're not interacting with a human. You're interacting with a benign piece of hardware that can communicate both ways. Like you can literally talk to it and it'll talk back to you, and the human can communicate. So now you're mitigating risk. From a military standpoint, the reason why you'd want that is when we were hitting houses in Afghanistan, you didn't know who stayed in the house and why. Most of the time, they were in one of two categories. They were either hostile or they were infirmed. So if you're in a house with the infirmed, you don't need to be as aggressive. There's no reason to be coming in guns blazing if it's just an old man in a bed, right? You're still going to be protecting yourself. But if I can send a camera in there and I can see that it's just an old man in the bed and the people in the house have said, hey, there's an old man in the bed, and I can see that, I'm less likely to go in there with the same amount of concern or aggression because I know the situation. I have situational awareness. And that process of entering a home is the most dangerous moment in warfare. And that is where we lost most of our lives. In addition, so we think of IEDs being the worst. It wasn't. It was room clearance. That's where we lost the most life. And so we wanted to mitigate that risk. And so that's where the drones became the most useful. And that's really what was basically the foundation of what I was chasing.
Right. That's fascinating. And I guess how far are we? Because I've seen some, I think, YouTube videos about like robotics being used in the field. Like how many years are we away from there being, I guess, robotic soldiers or robotic dogs or whatever? Because I guess you could say an area of that would be drones that are mounted with guns that can go in and do field work. But how long do you think until we have like actual robot soldiers?
It depends what you want them to do.
Right. So the robot wars are like 25 years away, but having a robot go in the field and maybe do more reconnaissance is a little bit closer.
There are levels at which it will happen much sooner than later.
Okay.
But the idea of it perfectly replacing a human, I don't know if we'll ever really get there.
Okay.
Because we have in war something, you have attrition and graceful degradation. And graceful degradation is a very fancy way of saying that you're going to go, as things attrite, fall back. It always defaults to people hitting each other with sticks, right? And so there's at certain levels, there's going to be, I mean, look at Ukraine. Like they are using some of the most advanced forms of warfare, but they are still punching each other in trenches.
Right.
Right. It always gracefully degrades back to the human factor. And you can have as many robots as you want forward, but once robots wipe each other out, it's a matter of whose robots win over the other one. And then all of a sudden it's humans fighting the robots. But we get really inventive, and there are ways around defeating those things. Everything. There's always an innovative way to solve a problem with low cost means. And robots don't have human intuition. And it'll be a long time before sensors are able to understand and sense things the way that we do. And people don't really appreciate the complexities of the abstraction layers inside of a human's neocortex. And what I mean by that is everything inside of our DNA has evolved to deal with contingencies. Everything in our body adapts constantly. We are constantly ingesting information and then adapting to the way that information is given to us based upon models that we've created off of lifetimes of interactions, as well as the DNA of our evolution that has ingested all of this over time as well. That is so complex. And we think that we see these very elaborate ways in which GPT and robots are expressing things based upon language models, and we're blown away by it. What we are not appreciating are all of those other almost microscopic abstraction layers that are taking place constantly, that are so hard to replicate. And that's why when I see robots in the field, I'm like, that'll be good for this one use case. But will it replace a dog? No. Because a dog has the same development that we do. It can adapt in ways that the robot has to be trained with for years. And I'm not undermining certain things. There's certain things robots are going to do way more effectively than people in isolation, but not in entirety.
Well, I guess looking at the field now, like you have a bunch of different wars in different parts of the world, and political tensions heating up all over the place. Is there anything that concerns you in the field that you're familiar with either technology, or if there's a geographical area that you're more familiar with that you think people should be paying more attention to than they are?
So, if I were to give recommendation to the masses, the thing I'm worried the most about is misinformation and social media.
Yeah,
we don't ingest information based upon facts. We ingest factoids to reinforce ideologies. And then the algorithms reinforce ideologies. And then ideology, if you're ideologically minded, it becomes your personality. And that's where it becomes dangerous, is when you're no longer able to ingest information for the purpose of objectively understanding the problem, but you're doing it to reinforce a mentality, regardless of how that factoid is presented, who presents it, and whether it's true. That's why I say factoid. A factoid is information presented as if it's the truth when there's nothing, when you are not likely to go back and fact check it or trust the fact checking process. And that is where communication breaks down. This is where we become tribalistic. And that's where you end up with massive psychological misinformation campaigns taking place.
Yeah, I mean, you probably pick 13 examples right now just off the hop. Different governments, different organizations that are doing these on different scales. Are you seeing people that are, I guess, on the innovation side, cyber has probably become the most crucial. Are you seeing any developments on that give you hope that there won't be a giant blackout the eastern seaboard or things like that? Like, is there things to be hopeful for?
Well, there's always something to be hopeful for. I would never. I'm not a naysayer. I'm more or less the just be open, just recognize the problem for what it is.
Right.
From the cyber standpoint, everything is vulnerable. Basically, everything effectively can get at. It's just why. How do they? Who actually benefits from doing that? And there are organizations that are doing a tremendous job of managing those things, like Cloudflare. There are cryptographic solutions that are coming out for quantum defeating technology, cryptography, that are very heartening. There are lots of ways in which we are solving different problems, and we continue to innovate. And that's why I go back to that misinformation part. Is once again, I'm less concerned with technology as I am with humans perceiving reality in a way that is inconsistent. And this is something that I've worked into my books, and that is that the aspect of AI. So you mentioned it earlier, and I guess I'll just plug my own book now, I guess. So I wrote I wrote a book called The Hawk Enigma, based upon my experience in the military. It's fiction, and it's about an individual who kind of like did a job like I did. I mean, start with what you know, right? And he deals with post-traumatic stress, but he doesn't tell anyone about it. He just manages it in a way that he thinks he can deal with it. But he starts hearing these voices in his dreams that are telling him about the future, and he's legitimately thinks he's losing his mind, until he gets brought into this task force that's going after has to go find these scientists who developed something called the God algorithm, which is a type of artificial intelligence. And so the book explores a type of AI that people aren't expecting. People always think of AI as a disembodied voice telling you about the future, or not the future, but just a disembodied voice based off of GPT that is effectively the sentient being. And I wanted to explore a part of AI that helps people understand that there are so many more complex layers to machine learning that are both fantastical and very horrifying, and also extremely exciting at the same time. So there's so many layers to it. But the one that I'm about to finish the sequel to my first book now. It's with my editors. In that book, there's an entire section where I explore psychological operations and misinformation online. And there's an entire group of people that are getting incited into conducting riots completely based off of a PSYOP campaign on social media. and there's a government, in this particular case, it's a government agency behind it. However, there are many cases in which these things are being artificially created just through social media groups on websites like 4chan, right? And so you'll see these things build up, and it's so easy to proliferate it that we always have to be, if I could recommend anything to anyone, is that look at the way that you ingest information. Look at the source of where you're ingesting information. If you are getting your news on Instagram, I think you are, I'm not going to phrase it this way. I'm going to phrase it just bluntly, that you should not be getting your news on Instagram, because it is not designed around fact checking or citing your sources. You literally can't cite your source because they don't let you put links in a meaningful or effective way to go back to. That you can, but most people don't. They just run their mouth and say, guess what these guys are doing? And then people say, that's what they're doing. And then they repeat it, or they forward it, right, or they retweet something instead of saying, are they? Who's putting this out and why? And then you go back and you say, oh, it's this news organization that is obviously very in the pocket of this other organization. Did somebody else post that? And then you discovered nobody else posted it, or it was only being posted by influencers online. And then you realize right away, you're like, this is a psyop. And so,
yeah, I think one of the saddest things that sometimes it's so easy to understand that this is disinformation. Like if you see something that, well, like you said, fuels your kind of anger motive, your rage button, then you're happy in that state, and you're just going to believe that, you're going to share it, etc. But if you just were to Google, like, fact check this story or this, like, you would find, in my opinion, more credible sources that can explain to you and cite their sources of, like, oh no, that never happened, or that photo was taken 6 months ago, or all of these things. And so I think that's the most disheartening, that, like, people just want to feed that rage engine continually, and it doesn't matter how shit the website looks. They just, oh, I'm right, so I'm gonna stay with this position.
I had an incident in which I was still working at the headquarters of the SEAL teams, and I'm not going to say, people easily figure this out, but I don't want to get political. But I'm just going to, this is just an example. So there was a tweet that was retweeted by the former president, and someone very close to me forwarded it to me, and they said, hey, did you see this thing saying that the specific instance was that Obama had the SEALs that were on the bin Laden raid killed in this helicopter crash? Did you see this? This is somebody very close to me. And I was like, you realize I work at the headquarters of the SEAL teams, right? You mean I was at the funeral of those guys. One of them was my friend. And he's like, yeah, isn't it crazy? And I'm like, it wasn't the same platoon. It was a different group of people. It wasn't the same ones. Those guys are still alive. And he's like, dude, you need to look into this. And I'm like, what do I need to look into?
Jesus Christ.
You're asking about my lived experience and the people that I literally know was there. And I have access to the information that gives me the after action report of what really happened that the public can't see. And I'm telling you, that's not true. I mean, it was still like,
shit didn't happen like this.
It didn't happen. It just didn't happen. And then it blew my mind because I was so confused.
Oh my God.
I was
like, did he ever collapse his opinion on it, or no? He just saw one article and thought that the guy he knew that works for the SEALs is misinformed.
He didn't want to fight me, but he would still fight me on other parts of the topic. And I was like, I think it's interesting that you're trusting these other individuals over, one, somebody you're so close to, but also literally somebody who has access to the truth. And
oh God, that is insane. Because
that's where it's an ideology versus fact checking. It's not. It's their personality. And once it gets that state, there's no communicating with them anymore. And it's unfortunate because it's cult-like behavior, and it happens on both sides of the political spectrum. Everybody does it. It's exacerbated by social media.
Well, I think I found this especially frustrating during the pandemic. Like, there were some friends that in the early days we would be collaborating to try to understand what was happening. Like, it was like, how serious is this virus? What do we know? Trying to contact experts that we're friends with, that we could try to get some information. But then some people, you could tell, and it took me too long to figure this out, that they just wanted to argue. They were in that rage engine. And so I would be trying to share something, and then they would be, no, but this is because of this, and this person wants you to, big pharma, blah, blah, blah. And if you try to agree with 10% of what they're saying, but you're not totally on board with their nonsense, then they just want to keep arguing. And your example is the most insane one I think I've ever heard.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, but that's why I like exploring it in my stories, because I'm like, it kind of totally points out the literal problem, and it calls it out in an overt way without attacking without attacking the same certain groups of people, and some people like, I resemble that remark. Like, like I don't want to go there, but I also want to be like, hey, there's recognize where you're getting your information, step back. With like my parents, I had to be like, okay, turn off this news organization for a while and let's have a chat, because they were getting fanatical. It was crazy. And but then
you're
when
like,
all
can
of
we
a
have
sudden
a chat and maybe have a hug? Like,
yeah, no,
what's going
what's
on
funny
here?
is when they turned it off for a while, all of a sudden they went back to normal, and you're like, oh, the rage machine is no longer feeding you.
No way. It was that
Yeah, within a week.
instantaneous.
If they weren't thinking about it all the time. And then they started talking
Right.
about things that actually matter. Like, okay, let me tell you about what's happening with, and it's not just, I mean, it happens. I've had this with several people that were able to finally shut it off, but
Yeah.
it's when you isolate
Man,
yourself and you no longer allow other people to just reinforce
that's
your
hard.
narrative.
I've heard a lot of people and a lot of families have had issues like that in general. And I definitely don't want to paint one side worse than the other. Like, there is misinformation and rage farms on both sides of this political spectrum all over the world. But yeah, I think some news organizations, like you alluded to, like they're specifically pouring kerosene on that rage button for everybody.
Yeah. And I will, when I look at the news, I'll look at both sides. Like in the United States, it's at Fox News and MSNBC. If I want to see the exact opposite sides of a narrative, I'll just check those two news organizations and be like, okay,
Sure.
the middle is in between these two.
Yeah.
Like, let me check, because I tend to default to either foreign news or AP or Reuters, because it's boring, and
Right.
it's boring because it's factual. It's just like, this happened. You're like, okay,
Thank you.
there's no
Goodbye.
spin on that. Anybody else is interpreting this for me. You're just telling me that this organization was doing this and this happened. Like, that's all I needed to know.
Right.
So yeah, so the aspect of the advancement of artificial intelligence and robotics and all those things, it's extremely exciting. And but we also recognizing with the advancement of technologies, we need to culturally educate ourselves as to what it means and why, who's motivated to do certain things, and who's got our best interest. And most of the time, the only person that has your best interest is you. And so you need to just recognize what gives you the most balance, because uh, there's levels of anxiety that come out from it, and depression, and you just discover it's because you're overly fixated on internalizing a lot of this stuff. And so that's why, like, the advancement of technology, I worry less when I use things as tools, not as the reason for me, not the source of all my entertainment or source of all my information. And it tends to be
Right.
easier that way.
Wow, that's great. I think that's a good way to wrap up. JL, thanks for all that insight. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you and find your first book and the second book? Let us know.
Yeah, so I have a website, jlhancock.com. Pretty simple. But you can find me on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter as author JL Hancock. And you can pick up my book on anywhere that books are sold. Amazon in particular is pretty easy. It's called The Hawk Enigma. And then the sequel should be coming out. I'm going to be done with it in September, but I have to send it to the Pentagon for review, because I can't publish anything unless it's been reviewed by the government. So it'll be fine. It just takes a little bit. And so
Right.
hopefully by the end of the year, I'll have my second book out.
That's a great teaser that you have to send your book to the Pentagon in before you can have it approved to go out. And I'm
Yeah.
traveling next week for a few weeks, and so I'm looking for fiction. So I'm actually gonna go pick that up on Kindle after this call. So thanks for your
Please do.
time, and I look forward to reading it.
Great. Thank you. It's great being here.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you didn't enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.